Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The government is to take the East Coast Rail Line back under public control for the time being. The contract to run the London to Edinburgh line was given to Stagecoach and Virgin Trains for 8 years in 2014, but they've been losing millions of pounds. It's the third time in just over 10 years that ministers have called a halt to the East Coast franchise. Labour, which supports re-nationalisation, called the government's handling of the railways calamitous. Here's our transport correspondent, Victoria Fritz.
They say bad luck comes in threes. Well, the government will be hoping this is the last time it has to step in on the London to Glasgow line. Just 3 years after its latest privatisation, the East Coast Rail Line is heading back to state control.
So whether it's nationalised or not nationalised, you just want to be able to travel, and to travel at a price that you think is appropriate.
I'm happy the way it is, and I don't know, things tend to slip sometimes when they go under government control, but you know, it could work out better, hopefully cheaper fares.
I think that would probably be a good thing, because in private companies, the trains can be a bit of a nightmare. It's particularly travelling on a Sunday, the maintenance works, and it just seems to be all out of control, really.
Secretary Chris Grayling.
Today, the Transport Secretary was keen to downplay the impact of the line changing hands.
I don't want these changes, Mr. Speaker, to be of any anxiety at all to passengers. I want to reassure them that there will be no changes to train services, the timetable will remain the same, tickets purchased for future travel, including season tickets, will continue to be valid, customers will be able to continue to book their travel in the normal way.
Politically embarrassing for the government and a coup for Labour.
We've had reform, reform and reform. We've had bailout after bailout. Rail companies win, passengers and taxpayers lose. There's a definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. This is the situation we find ourselves in today.
This isn't the first time a private company has failed to fulfil its contract on the London to Glasgow line. In 2007, GNER relinquished control after its parent company ran into financial difficulties. Just 2 years later, the contract with National Express was torn up after the financial crisis. The line was then taken in-house under directly operated rail until 2015, when it was then handed over to Virgin Trains East Coast Partnership. That deal was supposed to run until 2023.
Each time a private company bids for this line, they have to make an educated guess as to how many people will use the service and how frequently, because that determines how much money they can make in ticket sales. And each company that's bid for this line is being over-optimistic about the amount of money it can make.
The route will be rebranded as the London and North Eastern Railway. Although services here won't change, the business model underpinning the railways will have to.
And Victoria is at Peterborough Station for us now. Victoria, where does this leave the debate between public and private ownership of the railways?
Well, Rita, that's the big question, is it? I mean, ultimately it comes down to how we value and pay for our public services, and ultimately who should bear the burden. Now, the train companies that were behind this failed franchise, they've already lost about £200 million over 3 years. So far, taxpayers have been shielded from any shortfall, and on the face of it, it is the government who is set to lose the 2.3 billion of the 3.3 billion that was promised over the lifetime of this franchise. But how much money anyone is ultimately going to make or lose on this service will depend on what kind of money they can get from the replacement service.
Victoria, thank you. Our transport correspondent, Victoria Fritz.
So the government is bringing the East Coast Mainline back under state control, ending the franchise agreement with Virgin and Stagecoach, saying they'd got their bid wrong. Transport Secretary Chris Grayling denied Labour's accusations that it amounted to a multi-billion-pound bailout, insisting taxpayers had not lost out. Our political correspondent Michael Crick has this report.
5 weeks from now, Virgin and Stagecoach, known as VTEC, give up their franchise and the East Coast Mainline will return to public control. The third time in 12 years a government's had to step in and rescue the East Coast service from a private operator. But in a romantic touch on the line which once ran the Great Flying Scotsman, another great name from the past will be back. The LNER, the old London and North Eastern Railway. But this is not renationalisation, ministers insist.
The new LNER operation will be a partnership between the public and private sectors. In all circumstances, ownership of the infrastructure will remain in the public sector, but I believe the railway is at its strongest when it is a genuine partnership between public and private.
But passengers, he said, needn't worry.
There will be no changes to train services. The timetable will remain the same. Tickets purchased for future travel, including season tickets, will continue to be valid. Customers will be able to continue to book their travel in the normal way. And the ambitions we have for services, also important to say, Mr. Speaker, will continue.
Virgin and Stagecoach have jointly run the line for 3 years now, but the fall in petrol prices boosted car use and so hit their revenue. It's cost the firms almost £200 million in losses, but Labour say that in letting them quit the franchise 5 years early, they've given a huge bailout to the private sector.
In the last year, the Transport Secretary gifted Virgin Stagecoach a £2 billion bailout after they failed on the East Coast Mainline, at the same time as awarding these same companies a lucrative contract extension on the West Coast.
Labour also attacked Chris Grayling's announcement today that despite what's happened, he won't ban Stagecoach or Virgin from bidding for rail franchises in future. Indeed, both firms could now bid for the long-term partnership on the East Coast line. Grayling's new model integrating private operators and the public infrastructure, which he plans should start in 2020.
Well, Michael's still in Westminster. Michael, how significant is this?
Well, I don't think we're talking here about a sort of nationalisation along the lines of 1948 or even public ownership, really. It's public control, and it's only a temporary measure for the next 2 years before Grayling gets in this partnership. But we are seeing, I think, a significant evolution in railway policy, a recognition the old franchise system, which has existed for 25 years since John Major brought it in, hasn't really worked, particularly in the case of the East Coast Main Line, where 3 franchisees have failed, and where the people there has been a lot of overbidding. So an evolution of policy here. But what's fascinating is the way in which the politics of this has changed. In the last 25 years, the number of passengers on the railways has more than doubled. And yet, right now, Labour's struck a chord with its policy of renationalisation, which polls suggest is supported by the general public by 2 or 3 to 1.
Michael, thank you for joining us. Well, no Transport Minister was available to speak to Channel 4 News, so instead of joining us is the Chair of the Transport, who's going to speak to
exactly.
Cathy.
Lillian Greenwood, who's Chair of the Transport Select Committee. Ms Greenwood, Chris Grayling says that there's no loss to the taxpayer. Do you beg to differ?
I don't think that information is correct. We were promised back in 2014 that there would be £3.3 billion paid over the course of this franchise. It's been terminated early, and I think looking at the papers today, we think the Treasury will be experiencing a black hole, something of the order of £400 million as a result of this franchise being terminated early. And obviously that creates a problem for the Treasury, for the Department of Transport. That money has to come from somewhere.
Where are you getting that figure from, the £400 million?
Well, I think in the papers that they published today, they've said how much they expect to receive in premier payments between 2018 and 2020, and compared that with how much were expected in premier payments at the time that this franchise was agreed.
Is the East Coast Main Line a special challenge, or do you think there is a bigger turning point here and that we're really seeing the end of the line for the privatised railways?
Well, I think it certainly indicates that franchising really isn't working. My committee are already got an inquiry going into the East Coast franchise failure, which, as you said, is for the 3rd time in 10 years. We've already taken written evidence, and we start our oral evidence on Monday. Obviously, the Secretary of State will be appearing in front of us. I think he has questions to answer, and we won't looking to be fobbed off. We want to know why this went wrong, who's accountable, who's responsible, what's the fault of the operators and what's the fault of the department.
Well, of course, your own party, Labour, has pledged to nationalise the railways as each franchise lapses. How quickly would Labour have the entire network in public control?
Well, I suppose that depends on the state of the franchises at the time that there's a general election. But I think the question in front of us today is around the failure of the East Coast. Why did it happen? Who has responsibility? And my committee are determined to get to the bottom of that because, frankly, lessons don't appear to have been learned, given that this is the third time that it's happened. And we know that there are other franchises that are going to struggle to make their premium payments, and that's why the conclusions that were reached earlier, that this is a turning point for franchising, is absolutely correct. There are fundamental flaws that need to be addressed.
But is nationalisation the answer, particularly when, for example, one of the franchises is not set to renew until 2030? So, I mean, you could take 2 decades to get the entire sector into the public sector.
Well, that's right. I think one of the questions that passengers will be asking is why on earth this franchise that was operating very successfully in the public sector was re-privatised only for 3 years in for it to fail and for Virgin to effectively be forced to hand the keys back.
What's your answer to that question then?
Well, that's precisely why my committee are looking at this. I think it was a missed opportunity to look at what a public sector comparator could do. That was what I argued at the time. Obviously, I'm approaching this now with a different hat on, but the Select Committee want to understand why lessons weren't learned, what decisions were taken by the department, because it seems quite likely that they should have foreseen this and shouldn't have allowed it to happen.
Well, Chris Grayling is promising a public-private partnership on this line from 2020. Is that an approach that could work, in your view?
Well, that's also part of our inquiry. This idea of vertical integration, of joining together operator and the public sector infrastructure body, has been tried in a few places where it's been called deep alliances or other things. It hasn't so far been clear that it's actually delivering. And to be honest, the East Coast Line is a very strange place to try it, because this franchise is just one of a number of, I think it's 10 different private operators that operate on the East Coast Main Line. But that's one of the issues we'll be looking to address as part of our inquiry.
Lillian Greenwood, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Who should be running our railways is a live political issue at the moment. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has long championed the re-nationalisation of the railways. So it was against that backdrop that the government had to make the uncomfortable announcement that the East Coast Main Line between Edinburgh and London will be returned from private to state control. It is the third time this has happened on that line in 10 years. Virgin Trains, which has been operating it for the past 3, failed to make it pay and has welched on its contract.
It's a vital link carrying millions of passengers between London and Edinburgh. But while Virgin and Stagecoach promised the government £3 billion for the privilege of running the East Coast Line, they couldn't make it pay. Having announced it was being brought back into public ownership, the Transport Secretary admitted tonight he wouldn't risk offering it to a private company again.
Would you, as Transport Secretary, ever consider putting the East Coast Line out to tender again?
We're never going to tender the East Coast Main Line as a franchise in the way it's been done in the past. This is going to be a different kind of railway.
So privatisation has failed?
The East Coast Partnership is going to be, now the LNER is going to be a different kind of railway. What we're shaping is not one where you have a franchisee for 7 years sitting alongside a network rail operation. It's going to be a joined up organisation.
This is the third time a private operator has failed on the East Coast Line. GNER was stripped of the franchise in 2007 when its parent company suffered financial problems. National Express took over for just 2 years, pulling out having made big losses. It was then run by the Department for Transport until 2015, when Virgin and Stagecoach were given the contract. In February, it was revealed the consortium had got its numbers wrong and had overbid. Today, the contract was terminated. The service is being rebranded as the London and North Eastern Railway. It was last called that in the 1940s. Labour says it's time the whole network was nationalised.
It's
demonstrated beyond any doubt that franchising has completely failed, and we've got to have a complete rethink, and I think the government will be well advised to look very carefully at bringing the whole thing back into public ownership.
Lord Adonis, Transport Secretary, when the line was previously taken back into public ownership, says it won't solve all problems, but the service should get better.
Well, I hope the service will improve. When we nationalised the East Coast in 2009, passengers thought the service got better, it was better value for money, and we treated the staff better too, which also tends to rub off on the passengers as well.
Among rail users tonight, a generally positive reaction to the move back into state control.
Well, if it improves the services, then it's no bad thing, but I think whoever's operating it just needs to run it properly.
It's so expensive, it's insane. So if there was a way to make it cheaper, then whatever way that would be, really.
Well, something needs doing, doesn't it? Because it's been a bit of a mess over the last 10 years or so. So it's changed hands that many times. Hopefully it'll be successful this time.
Whatever happens in future, it's a big embarrassment for ministers who once claimed private would be best.
Libby joins me now from Westminster this evening. Where does this all leave the model that we've had since the privatisation of the railways, Libby?
Well, you heard Chris Grayling there in my report effectively saying that ministers, having got their fingers burnt 3 times with private companies running the East Coast rail line, he wasn't going to risk it ever again. Now, that's quite an admission from a Conservative minister, and I think it suggests there has been a seismic shift in their thinking. For the last 20 years or so, instinctively, they've been thinking in private and publicly saying that privatising companies is a way of making them more efficient. I think they are now moving on to Labour territory, although they wouldn't admit that publicly. You may remember that a year ago this month, the Labour Party was launching its election manifesto promising to re-nationalise the railways, a policy that turned out to be quite popular with the public. Now, I think it would be wrong to assume that they were turning their back entirely on privatisation, but I think this particular model is likely to be binned. It was a model that many people say was flawed because it encouraged companies to bid huge amounts of money in order to get a contract. It was the only way they thought they had a chance of winning, and at the same time they also took on all the risks for the revenue on these railways. Should that revenue fall short, then they would get into trouble, and that is exactly what has happened in this case. And I don't think this model is going to be replicated anytime soon.
All right, Libby Vina, thank you.
Sometimes there are challenges in the House of Commons that no one is expecting, particularly not the Transport Secretary, like this one today from the Labour MP, Jenny Chapman.
Look behind him, perhaps, and say, "My name's Chris Grayling and I've just nationalised a rail line."
Yeah. Chris Grayling, you understand, had just told MPs that the Virgin Trains East Coast Line would be brought back under public control, and the operator had been stripped of its franchise to operate rail services between London and Edinburgh. The measure is only a short-term one, but the Corbyn cabinet are hoping the move is catching. They want to see the railways renationalised. So is this a one-off by the government or the beginning of an acceptance that private companies don't always do things best? Here's Helen Thomas.
Join us on a journey back in time. First stop 2009, and the last time the government assumed control of the East Coast Line from London to Edinburgh.
Today's events do not represent the failure of the system, but the failure of one company.
We won't stop here, another East Coast franchise failure, because today's rail policy is reaching back further than that. To the 1920s, the London and North Eastern Railway was one of the big 4 operators created that decade, and it's the name chosen for the East Coast in its latest spell of public ownership. So what happens next? Back in February, a company registered here changed its name from DFTOLR1, or Operator of Last Resort, to London North Eastern Railway. On June the 24th, it will take over the running of the East Coast Line. The staff will stay the same, albeit under new management, and it will effectively still have a franchise agreement with its government owner. But it reignites the argument over whether the way we organise our railways is working.
The system is broken, and it's not just franchising, it's the whole model of privatisation. It's an ideology that hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for the past 30 years. And we really need to move beyond it, because we've got extremely high fares, we've got overpacked carriages, and passengers and the public are really sick of it. I think there is a sea change. I think the government is really feeling the pressure on this one.
So is national ownership back in fashion? Why won't the government call this what it is, which is the East Coast Line being re-nationalised again?
Well, it's not re-nationalisation because we don't intend to keep this in public ownership for any longer than necessary. We're taking it into temporary public control. Of course, there are always lessons to be learned from failure, and the department is learning them, but we shouldn't see the use of the operator of last resort as an indictment of the franchise system, because it's not. It's always been in the franchise system right from the start as an important mechanism within it.
The private sector even has a hand in this temporary period of public ownership. A private consortium is contracted to help run the operator of last resort. Acknowledgement, perhaps, that the Department for Transport doesn't have all the expertise needed in-house. So, could there be more trouble ahead for rail franchising? Well, one reason Stagecoach got its numbers wrong on the East Coast is that rail passenger numbers, after decades of growth, have started to fall. There are rumours of revenue shortfalls at other operators. The government and the system could ill afford another operator getting into trouble. Were these the glory days? Or did private capital bring more investment and more passengers to Britain's tired, inefficient railways? If and when the East Coast returns to private hands, it will be a question of hoping. Fourth time lucky.
That was Helen Thomas. Andy MacDonald is the Shadow Transport Secretary and joins me now. Thanks for coming in. You would presumably see this as a good move then today by Chris Grayling?
Well, it's a step in the right direction. It's taking the railway back into public control. But as we heard, it's merely a temporary measure. The intention is to parcel that franchise up with control of the track itself and put that out to a partnership. And that could well mean Stagecoach Virgin re-entering the fray and being the controlling party in that arrangement, which a lot of people will find absolutely outrageous.
You heard Joe Johnson there, the Minister, saying don't start thinking this is the beginning of nationalisation. It clearly isn't. The government is sticking very much to its plans to carry on these franchises. Labour is absolutely committed to re-nationalisation.
Well, it does seem that the government's committed to this failed system. The evidence today is that it's broken, it's finished. We are absolutely committed to bringing the railway back into public ownership with a guiding mind, an integrated railway in public ownership and a devolved railway for the regions and nations of Great Britain.
It's attractive, clearly, to the public. It's a bold move when you look at the actual numbers, isn't it? There's so much passenger satisfaction now, 83% in a major poll, with the safest railway system in Europe. We've got a 114% increase in passenger numbers since privatisation, and investment's up ninefold. So you're staring at the facts and saying, we know better and we're scrapping all that.
No, what we're saying is that we have great faith in the people who work on our railways. They do deliver satisfaction. What we are observing, though, is a system that's predicated on extracting value out of the system that takes it out.
But investment is in. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? So is your investment going to be ninefold of where we are today, because that's the rate they're on?
Well, we want to see all of the investment into the railway. At the moment, you've got people like Deutsche Bahn and Nederlandse Spoorwegen taking those profits out of the system and, quite rightly and understandably, investing that in Germany and in Holland and in France and in Italy, all those European state-owned monopolies who are here extracting value out of our system.
Well, it's really interesting.
Denying us the opportunity to run our own railway system.
You're talking about state-owned monopolies. You're looking at France. You know, if any of our viewers look towards France right now and the SNCF, which has got huge industrial action, which has got 60 billion euro of debt, which has got fares that are pretty much the same as here, if not more. Why would that be an attractive offer?
Well, I would question the issue of expense. We've got the most expensive railway system in the world.
We literally did a comparison.
To 40%.
I promise you, we've been looking at comparisons. London to Glasgow or Paris to Marseille works out exactly the same price. Yes. And they've got quicker trains that go further distance.
Well, we want to have quicker trains. We want to have
But my point is they've done it. They've done it under a state-owned system, which, is just as expensive for passengers and which, as we know, is absolutely embroiled in industrial action now and huge debt. Why would you want to copy that model?
We don't want to have industrial action. We want to work in partnership with the people who are working in our railways to take that out of the system. Our railway is characterised by appalling industrial relations at the moment. We see it on Southern, we see it elsewhere throughout the network. That is totally and utterly avoidable, and it's a question of dogma that's dictating these sorts of outcomes.
Well, you talk about dogma, and one of your big pledges is this fare freeze, isn't it? You know, commuters will save under nationalisation. Am I wrong? That
You're wrong about that.
OK, so in the last manifesto it said commuters will save, I thought it was £1,000 over the next Parliament. Right.
It's not a fair freeze. What we're saying is we're going to substitute the rate of increase by taking away RPI and substituting with CPI, a lower rate of increase. It's a prudent, sensible and managed approach to fares.
Which could save £1,000, right?
Could, yes.
Which is great if you are, you know, let's be honest, a fairly well-to-do commuter. But people on lower incomes don't get those trains regularly in and out of the major cities or conurbations. Won't they be looking at you now and say, well, why are you subsidising trains for, you know, fairly well-off people who are commuting? Where was the many
I want to get
few?
away from the person who has to turn up at a railway station at the last minute for a funeral, whatever it may well be, maybe not a regular train user, and has to pay through the nose. We've got a complex railway ticketing system that needs to be addressed. It's the most ridiculously complex and fractured system that anybody could ever imagine. There are millions and millions of products out there for a simple method of going from A to B, and if you can take away the multiplicity of providers and have responsibility for point A to point B, we can make a much simpler and more streamlined system that delivers much greater value for the travelling public.
Andy McDonald, great to have you here. Thank you very much.